At 11:40 p.m. on April 14, 1912, in the middle of the North Atlantic, an unsinkable ship hits an iceberg. 2 hours and 40 minutes later, it was in the depths of the ocean. 1,500 people died that night, and 4 decades this tragedy was hidden away in history books, museums, and in the memories of the few survivors still alive to tell it. Until 1997, when someone had the idea the world needed to feel it again, not to read of it, not to learn it, to have a tender heart. For 4 years, James Cameron was obsessed with the Titanic. 12 times he dived to the wreck on the bottom of the ocean. He had lived longer in that sunken ship than the original passengers had lived in it alive. When he finally came up for air and stepped behind the camera, he had a very clear idea of what he wanted to do. He wanted to make the ultimate Titanic movie. It's not a doc, not a thriller, a poem of love and death that would bring the whole world to tears. The result was the film Titanic. The impact of this movie on the movies, the box office, the Oscars, and popular culture is a story as remarkable as the tragedy it tells. Picture the studio executives' stomachs tying themselves in knots when the film was released in the United States in December 1997. The budget was up to $200 million, the most expensive film made in the history of the cinema at the time. In fact, adjusted for inflation, the cost was more than the construction of the actual ship. I am not over-exaggerating. The original ship cost about $150 million in $1,997. The film was more expensive. Cameron spent more to recreate the Titanic than the White Star Line spent to build it. And worse, the movie was behind schedule. It was behind on delivery. One of the co-producing studios, Paramount Pictures, was so jittery it even thought about dumping the project in the trash. Already Hollywood corridors were buzzing with talk of the film as the next big cinema disaster. Predictions proclaimed that Titanic would go down at the box office just as the ship had gone down in the ocean. Cameron took his own $8 million salary without complaint, out of confidence in the project. This is the film he threw himself into. And then the results were in. Titanic alone grossed $28 million in the United States in its opening weekend. It earned even more money in its second week than in the first, more still in the third week. The film did not lose any momentum. It was rising. People went back to theaters week after week. Sometimes the same people came back 3, 4, 5 times to see it again. Young people who had cried at the first screening came back with their parents. Couples went together. It was a social phenomenon without precedent in Hollywood. Not for a while, at least not since, perhaps even since ever. Titanic went on to gross $1,840 million worldwide by the end of its run in theaters. It is the first feature film to earn over $1 billion, and it was the highest-grossing movie of all time for 12 years until James Cameron's next movie, Avatar, unseated it from the number 1 position in 2010. But the box office doesn't tell the whole story. With 14 nominations, Titanic entered the 1998 Academy Awards, tied for the most nominations with the classic All About Eve 1950. That night of the ceremony, it walked away with 11 statues, including Best Picture and Best Director. It joined Ben-Hur in the list of the most awarded films of all time at the Oscars. Only The Lord of the Rings, The Return of the King 2003, has managed to join them so far. The Oscars of us. Just think about it for a moment. It wasn't an awards movie. It was a movie made to melt hearts, and it managed to do both at once, in a way that no one expected. But what is so special about the Titanic? What is it about this film that brought billions of people to movie theaters all over the world? and they came out with red eyes and heavy hearts. Is this the love story of Jack and Rose? The size of the production, the historical reconstruction to the millimeter, Celine Dion's theme song? The truthful answer is all of the above at once. But it is mostly because Cameron knew one thing that few directors really know. The great tragedies of history only become real to people when they have a human face. When there is a personal experience, you hope, desperately, that a particular people will escape. And you don't just watch a ship go down. The real Titanic went down in 1912 with 1,500 people dead. But to most of us, those 1,500 people are just numbers. Historical fact. You can't have compassion for a number. Jack Dawson and Rose DeWitt Bukater never lived. They are characters of fiction. But when the music cues at the end of the film, when the camera pulls back and the screen is filled with the icy water of the Atlantic, the pain is all too real. You cry for the characters that never existed on a ship you know from the very first minute of the film is going to sink. That's cinema. Great cinema. Really. We're going to get right down to it in this video. Trust me, this isn't just a figure of speech. We're really going to go deep, just as Cameron did before he wrote the script, when he dove down to the actual wreck. We will tell you how James Cameron got this idea. We will talk about the chaotic, violent and sometimes chilling behind the scenes of a shoot that nearly destroyed several careers. We'll learn the story of Leo DiCaprio, who didn't want this role, and of Kate Winslet, who literally begged for it. We will go through the script scene by scene to understand who the characters are, what the symbols mean, and why the narrative choices were so on point. And we'll discuss its legacy, what Titanic did for cinema, for culture, for the way Hollywood still looks at epic films today. First off, let me get one thing out of the way. This video contains spoilers, many of them. Such analysis can only be done if we tell the whole story, if we reveal what happens, if we talk about the details of each scene. If you haven't seen the film yet, and honestly that would be a shame, because Titanic is one of those films everyone should see at least once in their life, then you might want to go see it first and come back here later. But if you have seen it already, if you are one of those who wept in the theater, or who have seen it at home a number of times, then prepare your heart, because we're going to go over every piece of this work. And one more word. Titanic is not just a great movie. It's a landmark, a before and an after in the history of cinema. Some films you dissect, debate and appreciate like a work of art. Then there are the movies that get you in different ways, that leave a mark on you. And every time you hear that music, you know the music I mean, you feel a thing in your chest. Titanic falls in this latter category. James Cameron took the film to a place no one had been before. More money than anybody ever spent. He built a ship from scratch and sank it in front of a camera. More than anyone who wants to avoid health risks, he dived into the ocean. He postponed the release date, went over all budgets, fought all the studio executives, made his actors sit in freezing water for hours, and did it all with the unshakable belief that he was doing something good. And it was worth it. And here we are. This is the start of the journey, the story of Titanic, the story of the film, and the story of the ship will be more alive than ever on the next chapters of this video. Hold tight, for soon the waters will be icy. It all starts with an obsession, not with movies, not with the script, with the bottom of the sea. James Cameron has always been a fan of shipwrecks. He had always imagined these great monuments from childhood, lost in darkness, silent and frozen in time. The idea disturbed him and enticed him that such great things, built to last, could sink into the water and stay there, forgotten, for decades. It was like the ocean just opened up, and ate a chunk of human history, no one to answer to. And no shipwreck had seized the human imagination that of the Titanic. Oceanographer Robert Ballard found the wreck of the Titanic in 1985 at a depth of almost 3,800 meters in the North Atlantic, southeast of Newfoundland, Canada. It was historic, and with rapt attention Cameron followed it. But the real spark that set off the powder keg came a few years later, in 1992, when an IMAX documentary, Titanica, utilized actual footage of the wreck. Cameron looked at these pictures and felt that thing that very few people can describe in words, but that everybody knows when it happens, the absolute certainty that you have to do something. Then he began to sketch out a project, a tiny synopsis, the seed of a thought, that went something like this: tell a story with scenes in the present at the wreck site, using submarines, mixed with the memories of a survivor, and recreated scenes of the night of the sinking. That was back in 1987. Another 8 years would pass before this thought would become a real production. But Cameron is not a director like the other directors. He was the director of The Terminator in 1984, Aliens in 1986, and The Abyss in 1989. Hollywood paid him off. He took his idea to the bosses at 20th Century Fox, the studio he was under contract to, and they listened very intently, a look that quickly became surprise. Cameron dubbed the project Romeo and Juliet on the Titanic, a romantic epic. Tres Horrors, a film set in the past. It is thought to cost not less than $150 million, and, oh, no Terminator-style action, no sci-fi villains, no fighter jets, and no shootouts. Fox looked at him if he had slipped into another language. Cameron himself said they reacted something like, "Okay, a 3-hour romantic epic. Obviously, that's what we want. Is there a little Terminator stuff in there? A fighter plane? A shootout? A car chase?" Cameron said quietly, "No, it's not that type of movie." The bosses weren't convinced, but they wanted to keep Cameron on long term at the studio. He was a director who brought in money, even if his projects were too ambitious. So they said yes, on one implied condition, that he would make the film on a reasonable budget and within a reasonable time. Spoiler: that's not how it went down. But before we can even talk about the production itself, you need to know the enormous amount of work that went on before a single camera rolled on dry land. The first phase of the project was an actual expedition. Cameron wasn't interested in the idea of constructing the Titanic entirely in a studio, with models and visual effects, and never getting to see the real thing up close. He wanted to go there, to see with his own eyes. For him, the credibility of the film depended on it. He had to film the real ship, more than 2.5 kilometers below the surface of the ocean, exactly as it was, and make the opening and closing scenes of the feature film, this real wreck. He argued with Fox that it would be cheaper to film the real wreck than to create simulated effects. "We can do all this with sophisticated models, motion control, and CGI at a cost of X, or we can go all the way to the actual wreck, which will cost X plus 30%. The difference isn't that big, and the results will be infinitely better." Fox took it. Cameron and the Russian research vessel Akademik Mstislav Keldysh on the North Atlantic in 1995. Divers, technicians, cameramen swarmed round him, and he could go down into special submersibles, Mir 1 and Mir 2, to where the pressure of the water is devastating, where every square inch is the weight of tons of ocean. That summer in 1995, Cameron and his team made 12 dives to the wreck of the Titanic. 12. The director himself admits that the first attempts were practically worthless. They still had to get used to the extreme conditions, the underwater currents, the difficulty of coordinating movements in a tiny submersible in total darkness. The first pictures were not of the right quality, and so they started over, again, until on the third or fourth dive they began to find what they sought. There were times of real danger for these shoots. On one dive, a submersible hit the hull of the Titanic, damaging both the sub and the ship itself, and pieces of the Mir's propeller flew over the superstructure of the wreck. Another time the water pressure blew out the outer bulkhead of the captain's cabin, exposing the interior. Such are the dangers of working at a depth of almost 4 kilometers, under conditions to which no human being is biologically adapted. But Cameron kept returning, again and again. He went in further, so I shot more. When the expedition was over, Cameron had spent more time inside the Titanic than any of the passengers or crew of the original ship, and emerged from the depths with hours of footage of the actual wreck. The real ship went down in under 3 hours. Inside he had been for several days, spread out over the weeks that his expedition had continued. Then he went and wrote the script, because this timeline is important. Cameron didn't start from a blank page creating a story and then researching the facts. He did the opposite. He studied everything first, literally dove down to the ship, and only then sat down to build the characters and the narrative. That's what set the tone for the script he wrote. He researched every detail of the Titanic's trip for 6 months. He read everything he could find on the subject, books, testimonies of survivors, the minutes of the boards of inquiry held in the US and England immediately after the disaster. He put together a remarkably detailed timeline of the few days the crossing took and, notably, a minute-by-minute timeline of the last night, from the time the ship hit the iceberg at 11:40 p.m. on April 14th until she finally disappeared beneath the waves at 2:20 a.m. On April 15, 1912, historical experts reviewed this timeline prior to shooting. From the start, they had a clear, precise vision of what happened that night, which part of the ship went down first, how the hull split in two, in what order the different decks were flooded. This wasn't science fiction. It was detailed recording in the service of tragedy. Cameron was interviewed dozens of times. He wanted the film to be the definitive visualization of this moment in history, like you had gone back in time with a time machine and shot it. He wasn't just asking for a story inspired by the Titanic. He wanted to build another Titanic. For him, the sinking always had the echoes of the 1958 British black and white film A Night to Remember, a production about the disaster that he had seen as a child and that had never left him. This sober, almost documentary-like film was imbued with a gravity of subject matter that Cameron loved. He openly admitted to have drawn scenes, even lines, from this film, such as the noisy party of the third-class passengers in the bowels of the ship, or the scene of the musicians playing on the deck while the ship sank. A Night to Remember was a filmed historical document, but Cameron wanted something else. He wanted people to know what happened, and to feel it in their bones. For that he needed to fictional characters, to lives that would live in this real world, that the viewer could follow, root for, and love. That when the ship sank, the pain would be personal. And that's how Jack Dawson and Rose DeWitt Bukater made their way into the history books. Not as historical characters, but as vehicles of feeling. The audience becomes a portal into the center of the tragedy instead of looking from the outside. And there, with a script in hand, began the biggest challenge to translate these pages into pictures. Building of the ship, building the cast as shoot begins. What followed was one of the most chaotic, dangerous, and remarkable productions in the history of cinema. To understand James Cameron, you have to understand the Titanic. And to understand James Cameron, you need to know that, At heart, he was never a film guy. Born August 16, 1954 in Kapuskasing, a small town in northern Ontario, Canada, he remained passionate about science, physics, marine biology, engineering, the sort of kid who would take things apart to see what was inside, who would spend hours reading books about the ocean floor, about distant planets, about how to build and destroy giant structures. He didn't set out to be a director and end up one. He was taught to dream of solving the mysteries of the world. At 17, he moved with his family to California in 1971. He attended Fullerton College to study physics, but dropped out before earning his degree. For a few years he was a truck driver. He drove trucks on California roads, and in his spare time read everything he could find about the film business. He started to understand that cinema was, in fact, a form of engineering as well, an engineering of emotions, of optical illusions, of technology that was, in fact, serving human imagination. Something really clicked when he saw Star Wars in 1977. He watched this film, and as a common spectator, but as a technician looking at a very beautiful machine, he left the theater with a question in his head that never left him. How is this done? And he didn't just admire the answer, but sought ways to get it himself. Cameron came in the back door of the business, through the back door of the back room, in the B-movie kingdom of Hollywood, Roger Corman's outfit, where he did a little bit of everything on low-budget productions, set design, special effects, second unit directing. It was a hard but effective school. You learn to get by with little, to fix things on the spot, not waste labor. At Corman's, these were years of working underground, of on-the-job training, of mistakes and scraping through. He directed The Terminator in 1984, his first film to feature him as the primary director. He made a sci-fi thriller for $6 million, grossed $78 million worldwide, and launched both Arnold Schwarzenegger's career and his own. The Terminator wasn't just a monster hunting flick. It was a film about technology, the fear of the future, the weakness of future humans against forces they themselves create, themes that would never go out of Cameron's creative fire. The series was started by Ridley Scott, and the second film, Aliens, was released in 1986. Cameron took over the universe from a previous director and added a new dimension, less psychological horror, more trench warfare in space. The film was a hit with critics and audiences alike. The Abyss, 1989, a plunge into the depths of the ocean, literally and figuratively, a project that directly foreshadowed his interest in the Titanic. The T-1000 character and its iconic morphing effects in 1991's Terminator 2, Judgment Day revolutionized digital visual effects and changed the landscape of cinema forever. He followed this up in 1994 with True Lies, again starring Schwarzenegger. All this progress mattered. 10 years on, and Cameron had made a name for a director who delivers on his promises. Profitable films of undeniable technical quality that push the boundaries of what is technically possible. But none of these movies were romantic epics. None were about a love story with two vulnerable human characters. No superpowers, no futuristic armor, no firearms. They all had to do with supermen, with machines, with wars in one form or another. Titanic was something else. On the other hand, it was a story of an extraordinary moment, lived by ordinary people. That was why it required a side of Cameron he had never had to reveal in broad daylight. In short, his vision for the film was contradictory, but in a very productive way. He dreamed, on the one hand, of documentary, quasi-scientific rigor, of recreating the Titanic so precisely that any historian could watch the film and never see an error. They examined the stairs, the color of the carpets, the porcelain of the plates in the first-class dining room, using the original historical sources. Cameron even hired a team of researchers to compare every frame of the film with original photos of the ship taken before the maiden voyage, but he also wanted to wring from it as much emotional intensity as possible. No documentary, a big melodrama that would make the viewer suffer in an unmistakable way. The project's core idea was to unite these two elements. In the script itself, Cameron had found an elegant solution to keep the two worlds separate. The documentary would be anchored by the actual wreck, filmed with submersibles, almost black and white, raw and silent. In this document, the scenes with actors, full of color, life and music, would appear like a dream. He had a very clear philosophy about the love story itself. Cameron said in interviews that he didn't want to make a typical Hollywood romance movie where the two heroes overcome some external obstacles and end up with a happy ending. He wanted a tragic love story, not because someone betrayed them or lied or made a mistake, but because the world wouldn't let them be together. The tragedy is not due to a character flaw, but to historical circumstances, and this, he thought, was much harder to write, but much more powerful to see. One day Cameron said, "Any idiot can tell the story of a villain to separate two lovers. What's really hard is to make them love each other just as fiercely when the whole universe is against them." But there is a political vision in Cameron that is rarely talked about, but can be felt in every line of the script. The real Titanic in many ways reflected Edwardian society, with its strict class divisions, where the wealthy could get into the lifeboats, and the poor were left on the flooded decks, with guards blocking the passageways. Of the 325 first-class passengers aboard, 60% survived. Only 24% of the 706 third-class passengers survived. Cameron didn't invent this inequality. It's already in the historical archives, but he made it the narrative's center, so the 1997 audience could feel it in their bones. Rose and Jack are not just a couple in love. They are two worlds colliding, and the connecting ship is the system that opposes them. Such a level of narrative intentionality required a director who was both technician and humanist. And Cameron, throughout his whole career, has never been anything but an engineer of emotions. The one who instinctively knows how to edit a scene to get a certain effect on the viewer, who knows that a close-up on an actress's face at the right moment can be worth more than 5 minutes of tricks. But the crew of the Titanic would discover another side of Cameron during the shoot, a side that caused serious tensions, pushed actors and technicians to their limits, and remained etched in the memories of all who worked on this production. Cameron was a real perfectionist. He wanted to shoot the same scene dozens of times until everything was perfect to the smallest detail. The light, the camera movement, the actor's expression, the temperature of the water dots. Sometimes the set resembled a battlefield rather than a movie set. Screaming, tension, moral and physical exhaustion. And through it all, Cameron, knowing exactly where he was going, unwavering in his course to get there. It took incredible endurance from those who stood beside him during this shoot. Amidst all this creative chaos were two young actors, soon to be the most recognized faces on the planet. Getting the right cast is half the movie. James Cameron often said about casting Titanic. And this was even more true with Titanic than any of my other projects. A 3-hour film that depends almost exclusively on the audience's emotional investment into principal characters can't survive bad acting. You can have the most beautiful ship never built for cinema, the most moving music in existence, the most impressive special effects. If the viewer doesn't believe in Jack and Rose, if they don't feel their love as something real and urgent, the whole film collapses. The iceberg need not even be visible. This is exactly why Cameron spent an incredible amount of care and luck on casting. Let's begin with the character, who might not have been played by Leonardo DiCaprio for his part, Jack Dawson, a young, unpretentious American artist, wins a third-class ticket for the Titanic in a poker game. Simple, free, optimistic, the one who sees life as an adventure and happiness as a choice. Thematically, Jack is the working class, the energy of immigrant America, the idea that living hard and real better than living in privilege and ease. Cameron had thought of a number of actors for this role. Matthew McConaughey auditioned and was a close second. Chris O'Donnell, Jared Leto, and Billy Crudup were also considered. But immediately Cameron thought of Leonardo DiCaprio, the 22-year-old actor who had burst onto the scene with What's Eating Gilbert Grape in 1993 and had just filmed Baz Luhrmann's Romeo plus Juliet in 1996. The problem was DiCaprio turned down the role. This is not a legend. It's not a Hollywood story. DiCaprio declined the project. Post Romeo plus Juliet, he didn't fancy the idea of falling into another grand romance. He was worried about his image, about being typecast as Hollywood's leading young lover, and all the impossibly coy characters that would go with it. This was a different kind of risk, he thought. A production of this magnitude, with this level of exposure. At this point in his career, Cameron had called for a private meeting. The two men met and Cameron was very clear. You will play Jack Dawson. I know you're the one who did this. You have to believe me. DiCaprio was still holding his ground. He asked time to consider. Behind the scenes in Hollywood, Cameron has earned a reputation for his response. If you don't do this movie, you'll regret it for the rest of your life. Yes, said DiCaprio. On the other hand, Kate Winslet, and the attitude couldn't be more different. In 1995, Winslet was a year older and had shot Ang-Lee's Sense and Sensibility, which earned her first Oscar nomination. When she learned Cameron was making Titanic, she went after the part with a single-mindedness that would have put even the most jaded industry veterans to shame. She kept calling Cameron. She sent him flowers with notes written by herself. People close to the production say that in one of the messages, she wrote something like, "I am Rose. Please, give me this chance." Cameron let himself go, caught up in her enthusiasm, but he had first put her through every test. Winslet did lots of camera tests, whole scenes shot in different ways, script readings, and as they tested, it became increasingly obvious she understood Rose beyond the technique. There was a real vulnerability there, combined with a growing strength, the emotional arc the character had to go through. The most complex character in the movie is really Rose DeWitt Bukater. Rose is the daughter of a ruined aristocratic family and is forced to marry billionaire Cal Hockley to save her mother's social standing. She is a prisoner of gold, surrounded by everything money can buy, suffocated by everything money commands. She is the Edwardian woman caught in a system of gender and class that gives her no real choices. Her meeting with Jack is not only a romance, but the catalyst for an existential change. Jack couldn't save her. She helped him save her. The chemistry between DiCaprio and Winslet was put through its paces even before shooting began. Cameron had arranged for the two actors to do scene readings together. The effect was immediate and was visible to everyone in the room. The energy between them was natural, spontaneous, fun, the kind of dynamic you don't create in directing or editing, that just is or isn't between two actors, and the supporting roles were treated to the same attention as the leads, Rose's rich fiancé. Caledon Hockley is played by Billy Zane, and he is probably the least sympathetic character in the film, the human antagonist who embodies everything repugnant about the Edwardian system. wealth without empathy, power exercised as domination over others. Cameron cast Zane because he could be charming and menacing, a man who would be a good catch in normal times, but who, in difficult times, shows how dehumanizing privilege can be. Kathy Bates plays Molly Brown, a real historical person, heiress to a Colorado mining fortune, who was nicknamed the unsinkable Molly Brown for her survival of the sinking and for her cheerful, proud attitude during and after the disaster. Bates infused her character with a cheerfulness, a vitality that is perfect comic relief, essential counterpoint to the growing tension of the action. Victor Garber stars as Thomas Andrews, chief naval architect for Harland and Wolff, builders of the Titanic, who was on board for the maiden voyage. Andrews is a figure of tragedy in history, a man who knew better than anyone that the ship was doomed after striking the iceberg, who helped passengers escape to the end, and who refused to try and save himself. Having been last seen standing silently in the first-class smoking room, alone, eyes closed, Cameron did that moment in the film almost verbatim, and Garber played it with an emotional restraint that was all the more devastating for its silence. Bernard Hill played another real historical character, Captain Edward John Smith, who was in command of the Titanic on her maiden voyage and went down with the ship. In the film, Smith is shown as a respected man who made the fatal error of keeping the ship the same speed in a region known to be full of icebergs, partly under pressure from J. Bruce Ismay. White Star Line's managing director, Bruce Ismay, anxious to reach the New York press ahead of time. Then there's Gloria Stewart, who is by far the most surprising and brilliant casting decision in the film. Stewart, aged 86 at the time of filming, played the elderly Rose. She was a 1930s Hollywood actress who worked for James Whale in The Old Dark House. Note, adapted for typical reference, like The Invisible Man, and then vanished for decades. Cameron saw her, spoke to her, and at once knew that she was the one to play Rose, as a woman of 100 years old, still carrying the intensity of one who has lived such a story. Stewart gave this character a serene dignity and human warmth, and the scenes of the old Rose, which could have been just a functional narrative frame, became moments of real emotion. At 87, she was the oldest nominee in the Academy's history at the time. For Best Supporting Actress at the Oscars, the cast was not only cast to be a character, but to be a level of meaning in the universe of the film, and the result was a human ensemble that made the ship, in all its splendor and tragedy, much more than a historical reconstruction. It made it a thing, a living, breathing thing. And when the water floods the first-class halls, when the musicians play on deck and couples embrace in the corridors, when Jack and Rose cling with freezing hands to a piece of wood in the middle of the Atlantic, the viewer is not watching a cast. They are seeing real life, real death. The rest of the film is based on this illusion, deliberately created, meticulously planned, played by actors who must have believed in the roles they were playing, and the physical side of this ship was one of the most extraordinary stories cinema has ever known. The script was nearly finished in 1995, and discussions were underway with the lead actors, when James Cameron met with the Fox producers and said something that made everyone in the room squirm. A ship. He had to build a ship, not a model. No studio set with a few rooms of the liner standing. A real ship, or as close an approximation to a real ship as the movies have ever attempted to build. A nearly full-scale replica of the RMS Titanic, large enough to shoot inside and outside, structurally sound enough to be tilted mechanically at increasingly dramatic angles as the script required, all positioned next to a tank holding millions of gallons of water to simulate the North Atlantic. The Fox executives wondered where this would be. Of course, the answer was obvious to Cameron, and completely unexpected to the others. Rosarito in the state of Baja California, Mexico. In theory, it made basic logical sense. Cameron wanted a seaside location, so that the horizon in the exterior scenes would be real, an authentic ocean, not a painted backdrop. He needed a piece of land big enough to build both the ship replica and the tanks, avoiding the zoning laws that would have prevented such a construction site in California. He needed local labor, too, who could keep a work crew going non-stop for several months, and who would be cheaper than in Los Angeles. Rosarito checked off every box. For this film, Fox built an all-new studio called Fox Baja Studios and paid for it all on its own. It was not a matter of retrofitting facilities. It was a complex built from scratch on what had been nothing more than a stretch of sand and sea. The studio itself cost tens of millions of dollars to build, before a single camera was turned on, before a single actor stepped in front of a set. The main tank constructed on the site was 17 million gallons of seawater, about 64 million liters, and it was built with direct access to the Pacific, so that when the cameras shot from certain angles, the horizon behind the actors was in fact the ocean. There was no fake backdrop behind it, no green screen, no digital composition. It was the real sea. This apparently technical point was central to Cameron's vision. The sense of scale, of isolation in the middle of the ocean, had to be real if it was going to look real on screen. Next to this tank, this ship was built, and even today, the figures are impressive. The reconstructed Titanic was 238 meters long, or approximately 90% the size of the original ship, to 169 meters. This was a reduction for convenience of construction, but Cameron made sure that the camera angles never showed the difference. The construction weighed 40,000 tons. The hull was 3 decks up from the water. Inside, sets were totally rebuilt: the first-class grand staircase, the a la carte restaurant, the cabin corridors, the engine room, the forward and aft decks, the bridge. Each room was decorated in accordance with original photographs, White Star Line catalogues of the time, and historical documents gathered over months of research. The grand staircase deserves a special mention. It's one of the most iconic sets in the movie. The first-class staircase, with its glass dome letting in natural light, its carved oak banisters, its central clock with allegorical figures. So determined was Cameron to recreate this space that he insisted on using the same wood as the original, demanded that the carvings matched the period photographs, and even the carpet was reproduced from the pattern documented in the Harland and Wolff archives. The Belfast shipyard that built the real ship, every square inch of the set was treated with the same care. The fine dining china was a reproduction of the patterns used by White Star on their kitchenware. Crew uniforms met the standards of cut of historical clothing. The deck chairs were replicas of the originals. Cameron had a historian on set whose job was to check every object in every scene to see whether it was period-accurate. There was good reason for this fevered devotion. Cameron knew very well that the audience going to see his film would consist of the Titanic crowd. The people who know the ship by heart, who can tell at a glance if something is wrong. But above all, he knew that the truth of details casts a breath of truth over everyday life, which the average honest man would feel with delight, though he might not be able to put into words what was most charming in the revelation. The human drama in that space appears all the more real because everything that surrounds the characters is real. The texture of the walls, the weight of the cups, the quality of light in the corridors. The building took several months. At the peak of the work, the Rosarito site had more than 1,000 workers on multiple shifts. Day and night the hum was. Cranes, scaffolding, electricity men, carpenters, painters, decorators, a hive of men building. A ship which for 2 hours would sail the bottom of the seas for no economic purpose, but which must give the exact illusion that there was a reason for its existence. Then came the hardest technical problem of the whole production, the problem of the sinking itself. The Titanic didn't just go straight down. It was a much more violent, complex process. Further study and inquiries into the wreck suggest that the ship slowly heeled over by the bow as the forward compartments filled with water. It was at about 10 degrees angle, then 20. Then the sea floor started to rise. The furniture, objects, people, everything began to slide, tumble, roll. The ship was starting to split in two when it listed at 25 or 30 degrees, entering intolerable structural tension, with a crash that survivors said was an explosion or a derailing train. For this movement on screen, he needed a physical ship set that would mechanically tilt during filming. The challenge was huge, to build a 40,000-ton structure that could also be used as a pivoting platform, something that had never been attempted before in the history of cinema. The solution was divided into two elements. The ship's stern, which rises dramatically in the final minutes of the sinking, was attached to a hydraulic mechanism that could tilt up to 90 degrees. What this means is that the sequence of the passengers hanging onto the railings as the deck becomes almost vertical was shot on a set that was really vertical, with real actors hanging onto real things, cameras mounted on special mounts, and a safety team of over 100 people managing the risks in real time. The front part was constructed on a platform that could be lowered into the water tank to simulate the sinking. All the scenes where water is pouring into the first-class corridors, submerging the stairs, and sweeping furniture and people away were done with actual water, at actual speed, and with actors in that space, which brings us to a point every actor who worked on Titanic makes when talking about the film. The water was freezing, tied down, not warm. Bring back to room temperature. Freezing. Cameron wanted to recreate the temperature of the North Atlantic that night in April 1912, about 2 degrees Celsius, just above freezing. Of course, the water on set wasn't actually kept at that temperature for safety and health reasons, but it was cold enough that after a few minutes in it, the actors began to feel the real physical discomfort the characters must have felt. Kate Winslet was filmed in this water for days on end. DiCaprio also. They were all bit players and featured players, soaked, chilled to the bone, exhausted. Medical teams were on standby at all times. They had to come out of the water completely to warm up. James Cameron called for one more take behind the cameras. But this was only the beginning of the production's problems. The early months of construction would seem like a walk in the park compared to what had to come, the accidents, the conflicts, the chaos that almost destroyed the film even before editing. You could make a list of the most difficult shoots in the history of cinema, and James Cameron's Titanic would be right up there in the top 3. For sure, not just because the conditions were physically draining, though they were. Not just because studio heads couldn't sleep at 3 in the morning when the budget was exploding, though that was true too, but because at one point during the production an event happened that no one had foreseen, that wasn't in any contingency plan, and that could have killed people. In August 1996, 80 members of the cast and crew fell ill during a night shoot in Rosarito. All of a sudden, at once, the symptoms were odd: hallucinations, great disorientation, incoherent speech, unpredictable behavior. It was an epidemic. Some thought it was food poisoning. Some had no idea what was happening. Ambulances came. Dozens of people were evacuated to local hospitals. It took doctors several hours to figure what it was. PCP was in the soup. PCP, short for phencyclidine, is a very powerful dissociative drug. It was first developed as an anesthetic, but doctors soon stopped using it due to its severe side effects and frequent consequences like intense hallucinations, severe paranoid anxiety, and unpredictable violent behavior. Someone, never publicly identified to this day, had slipped this substance into the clam chowder that was served to the crew while they were on break that night. One of those affected was James Cameron. It was a very disorienting experience. A spinning room, difficulty concentrating, a feeling of unreality 4 hours, he said later in interviews. But he quickly recovered when the effects wore off and immediately went to work finding out what had happened. The inquiry never reached a formal conclusion. No charges were filed. There was never any word on the motive. You think it might be a sabotage by somebody unhappy with the work done out of the conditions imposed on the set. Maybe it was something more personal. There was no way of telling. One thing was sure, they went back to work the next day. That's how Cameron was in the studio. He didn't permit a break in filming longer than was absolutely necessary. That determination was commendable at times and frightening at others, depending on which side of the camera. While on dock, Kate Winslet was one of the actors who endured the most physical strain during the shooting. Winslet injured her elbow in one scene where Rose has to run through the flooded corridors of the ship to escape the rising water. A small but painful fracture. She shot many scenes back to back with this injury and didn't leave the set. She was stuck underwater in a scene where her character failed to get away from a closed compartment in the flooded set and couldn't get to the surface as quickly as she needed to. It wasn't a life-threatening thing immediately. They had safety divers in the water at all times, but it was scary enough that she mentioned it in interviews years later. Cameron had a tumultuous relationship with Winslet as well during filming. She loved his vision and the quality of the work, but the process was exhausting in a way, she said, she had never and has never experienced before or since. Years later, she recalled with humor in an interview that she had given Cameron nicknames I cannot repeat here. Then she added, very sincerely, that Titanic had been the job that had most changed her career. Cameron was just as intense in his relationship with the technical crew. He never made any concessions. His quality demands were absolutely uncompromising. There were days when they shot the same scene 20, 30 times over, not because the actors made a mistake, but because a prop was in the wrong place, the light had shifted a little, or a camera movement was off by 1/10 of a second in its timing. The camera crew was very skilled and experienced, but worked under a constant pressure that was seldom experienced on Hollywood sets. Also, cinematographer Russell Carpenter won an Oscar for his work. Carpenter and Cameron designed a very specific visual language for the film, using a warm, bright palette in the scenes leading up to the sinking, gradually transitioning to colder and darker tones as the disaster unfolds. This chromatic arc was treated with extreme respect, which meant that the lighting on each set had to be precise, which in turn extended the shooting time of every scene. And then there was the schedule and budget that kept spiraling out of control. The production was originally scheduled for a run of 138 days. It was 160, more than 3 weeks behind schedule. Every additional day of shooting on such a set cost a fortune. The original budget, approved by Fox and Paramount, who split the bill for the project, was $150 million, already astronomical for the time. But as filming continued, the costs got so high that the studios couldn't keep up. Some of this overspend was the fault of Cameron's insistence on historical accuracy. If he found some historically inaccurate detail, even the most insignificant detail that no one would notice, he redid it. Sometimes you had to tear down and rebuild whole sets, because the research proved to be wrong. All of these decisions cost money and time. The water scenes accounted for the rest of the cost. Shooting in tanks of millions of gallons of water, with mechanical tilting structures, with actors and extras in motion, it was a logistical nightmare. Every shot took much longer to film than a comparable dry shot. On this soaking wet set, what usually took an afternoon for a take took 2 or 3 days. The budget soared over $200 million and Paramount freaked out. Even studio executives thought about stopping production, cutting their losses on what had already been spent, and just walking away from the film. Fox was concerned too. Meetings were hard, disguised ultimatums. There was pressure on Cameron to cut scenes, to cut the process, to compromise his vision. But Cameron never compromised a single directorial decision. Instead, he made a financial gesture that silenced most critics. He forfeited his director's fee, $8 million, and the percentage he was supposed to get from the film's profits. Basically, he agreed in writing that the movie didn't make back the money spent on it. He wouldn't get out of the mess with his own money. He would get nothing for 4 years of his life's work. It was a huge risk. It was also a very clear statement of confidence. Cameron, more by action than by words, demonstrated that he felt his film was going to be a success. There was also a time crunch thrown in, adding an extra layer of stress over the whole set. The release had been scheduled for July 1997 to cash in on the American summer season, the most lucrative time of year for blockbuster movies, but the delays made this impossible. The release was pushed to December 1997, which only increased tensions with the studios, as December is a particularly competitive and unpredictable month for big films. Hollywood scribes began covering the project with increasing skepticism. The film picked up the nickname Waterworld, with actors behind the scenes in the industry. This was a nod to Kevin Costner's 1995 epic, which had gone over budget, arrived late, and become synonymous with financial disaster. The trade papers largely predicted that Titanic would duplicate this fiasco, only on a bigger scale. In this atmosphere of doubt and pressure, of collective exhaustion, Cameron experienced the last months of the shoot as someone who simply would not entertain the thought that he could be wrong. His confidence was impressive and disturbing, a certainty that under other conditions may have seemed arrogance, but that in retrospect, after the film was finished and shown to the masses, became vision. But when the images were finally cut together in the editing room, when James Horner's music was there to accompany the scenes, when the reel rec opened the film and the love between Jack and Rose closed it, it became clear Cameron was right as a whole, and the story these images told was one of the most powerful in the history of film. The movie opens at the bottom of the ocean. No musical melodrama. No title glowing in gold letters on a starry background. Nothing. Darkness. 4 kilometers down. In the dead silence, where only the wreck of the Titanic has rusted and been encrusted with sediment for more than 80 years. A camera starts its slow descent to the floor of the North Atlantic. This opening is not only aesthetically powerful, it's a conscious and intelligent narrative decision. Cameron warns the viewer before a word is spoken. This is real. What you are about to see actually happened. There is a little iron. They live those lives. And I'm going to show you how this living, luminous world that you're going to see for the next 3 hours became this eternal silence you're looking at right now. It is one of the best opening scenes in the history of film, because it removes from the first minutes any risk of emotional detachment. When the first shots show us a real ship, dead, at the bottom of a real ocean, you can't say that this is just a movie. The action begins in the present, which according to the script is 1996. A dive team led by treasure hunter Brock Lovett Bill Paxton is exploring the wreck in search of a legendary diamond, the heart of the ocean, an extraordinary blue jewel that once belonged to King Louis XVI of France and which, records show, was aboard the Titanic the night it sank. Lovett and his crew find a safe in a first-class cabin. They dive down with a submersible to get it and bring it to the surface hoping to. But the diamond was not in the safe. It contains a piece of water-damaged paper. When opened, a remarkably well-preserved charcoal drawing is revealed, the portrait of a nude woman in her early years, wearing only a necklace with a blue heart-shaped jewel shining on it. The portrait is dated the 14th of April 1912, the night the Titanic went down. Lovett beams the picture of the portrait from his research ship and makes the news. Somewhere in the United States, an old lady sees her own face on the television screen. She makes contact with Lovett's ship. Her name is Rose Dawson Calvert, and this is the woman in the photo. The present frames the past, and this is one of the great decisions of the script. It sets up to threads of tension from the beginning that will run parallel throughout the story. The diamond is the problem of the present. Where is the heart of the ocean? The love story. What happened that night between Jack and Rose? In the past, the answer to both questions is the same, and it will come slowly as the film moves toward its final climax. Rose boards the research vessel along with her granddaughter. Lizzie, Lovett and his team greet her with the same mixture of curiosity and skepticism as any other centenarian who claims to have been aboard the Titanic to cause her memories to muddle, or her dreams to confuse reality. But when she talks, when she describes the ship in detail with a precision no book could have given her, when she asks to see photographs of the wreck and identifies them one by one, the doubt disappears. Then she starts to tell her story. One of the most beautiful transitions in modern cinematic language takes us back in time. The camera pulls away from the dark, rusty wreck, and when it returns the ship is alive, glowing in black and white, its four funnels spewing steam at the port of Southampton, England. It is April 1912. Titanic sets sail on its maiden voyage, and this is the beginning of the first act. Southampton, April 10th, 1912. The camera moves across the docks with the same energy, the same wonder a real passenger would have felt that day. The Titanic was and still is, even as a relic, one of the most imposing things ever constructed by the hand of man. It was 269 meters long, weighed more than 46,000 tons, and carried 2,224 people divided into three social classes who lived on board as three separate worlds. Here we meet Jack Dawson for the first time on this dock. He's young, with a backpack on his shoulder, and his smile seems to mock the painful notion of worrying. He sits at a pub table with his friend Fabrizio, a young Italian, near the port, betting his last cents in a poker game, and he gets the prize. In a bet just minutes before the ship sails, he wins his third-class tickets for the Titanic. Fabrizio, we're off to America. Jack runs up and down the docks, tickets in his hand, and hops on the gangway just as it's shutting. It's the perfect introduction to this character, impulsive, bold, led by chance, led by instinct, living completely in the moment. Rose's world is somewhere else. At the other end of the dock, Rose DeWitt Bukater arrives at the port in a luxury car, accompanied by her mother, Ruth, who is icy and calculating in her elegance, and her fiancé, Cal Hockley. Cal, a young millionaire, is arrogant, almost contemptuous of the rest of humanity. He treats Rose as an object of value to be displayed, protected, controlled, but never as a thinking, desiring being. The camera zooms on Rose's face when she sees the Titanic for the first time, in dock, and no admiration to be found, it's resignation. A 17-year-old girl is being put on board, not a ship, but a future that has been chosen for her, without anyone bothering to ask what she really wants. The central dynamic of the first act is two worlds limited on the same ship, divided by all the distance money and social class can put between them, about to collide in a way neither could have foreseen. The ship anchors. Cameron uses the physical structure of the Titanic as a living metaphor from the very first scenes on board. The upper decks, for first-class passengers, have natural light, large open spaces, restaurants of crystal and mahogany. The third-class passengers are kept deep down inside the ship, narrow corridors, tiny cabins, noisy, lively common areas. At the bow, Jack and Fabrizio stretch their arms to the Atlantic wind and enjoy their luck. Rose, 3 decks up in a luxury suite, stares out at the ocean, the empty eyes of someone who no longer sees anything. The first major turning point of this first act happens one night when Rose, overwhelmed by the pressures of high society dinners, the obligatory smiles, the weight of being watched and judged at every moment, runs to the aft deck of the ship, intending to throw herself overboard. It is not a scene of melodrama. Cameron shot it all with great restraint and respect. Rose is not having a fit of hysteria. She just doesn't see any way out. A person who no longer sees any viable path among all the solutions the world offers her. She leaned over the rail, her arms behind her, clutching the edge of the ship, looking down at the black foam of the Atlantic far below. Next there was Jack, not as a hero. There was no intro music, no slow motion. He's out there on the deck, a young guy having a smoke, and he saw something that shouldn't happen. He does not yell. He didn't call security, and he speaks to her, softly. He tells her almost teasingly that he would have to follow her in the jump to save her, and that the water is very cold this time of year, and so it would be better to climb. Back over the rail. Rose gazes at him. He looks at her, and there, in a close-up of the two faces, the wind in her hair, the black ocean below, something begins. It's arguably one of the best constructed meet-cute scenes in cinematic romance history, precisely because it's totally unconventional. This is not a meeting at a ball, nor a glance across a room, two outcasts, one literally on the edge of the ship's structure, and the other on the edge of a nowhere life she doesn't want. Meet in the one place neither of them belongs. In the last scene of the first act, Rose invites Jack in borrowed clothes, his hair slicked back, trying to remember the manners he never had to learn to dine in first class. He's totally comfortable in his own skin, and yet out of place on every level, and Rose is utterly fascinated. The ship proceeds. There are no clouds in the sky. Stars are shining. And somewhere out on the North Atlantic horizon, in the dark, something waits. Cameron uses the first scene in which Jack and Rose share the same social space, the first-class dinner, with surgical precision to establish the identity of these two characters outside their natural environments. Jack, in the borrowed suit, sat down at the table and attempted to look at home, and the most interesting thing that he almost gets away with it, not because he's playing a role, but because he has a real personal confidence that laughs at social charades. The other guests talked politics, or business, or the conventions of the Edwardian world. He, Jack, talked naturally of his life, his travels, his sketches, the freedom of living without set plans. Then there is the moment when he lifts a glass of wine to toast to making it count, an idea so simple and so radical at that table that it prompts a moment of silence before applause breaks out. Rose watched this with her most neutral expression, but it said it all. For the first time in a long while she saw anyone living without asking permission to live. Co was looking on too, but looking different. It is a credit to the script that it does not immediately render the antagonism between Cal and Jack a caricature. He's not a cartoon villain. He is a man of his period, genuinely convinced that society has a purpose, that wealth and status mean genuine superiority, that Rose is his property, an emotional and social investment which he is not going to lose. He does not fear Jack. He doesn't think he's a real threat at the moment. Jack asks Rose out on the deck after dinner. She stops, but she does. The film reaches its first emotional peak at this bow scene in the second act. Jack took Rose's hand and led her to the front of the ship, to the very tip of the bow. He had her put one foot on the railing, arms spread wide, while he held her by the waist. This is the most famous part of the movie. I'm flying, Jack, an image that seared itself into the collective imagination of a whole generation of viewers. But this scene isn't great just for its visual romance, but for what it means to Rose in that moment. For the first time in years, she's not held back, she's not watched, she's not judged, and she is there, the wind on her face, before the immensity of the ocean. No bars between her and the horizon. This is Rose's first moment of freedom, symbolically. The days that follow on the Titanic are the film's glowing epicenter. That time when Jack and Rose come together in a way that transcends mere flirting or physical attraction to tap into something deeper within them. Jack started to teach her to draw. Thanks to him, she learns of the underground world of the third-class passengers, of the rowdy parties in the ship's steerage, of Irish music, of dancing without manners or protocol. Rose, who was raised to never go out of approved social circles, dances barefoot with strangers deep in the ship, and laughs like she hasn't laughed in a long time. Cameron shot these scenes with an energy and warmth deliberately contrasted with the golden coldness of the first-class lounges. Color palette changes, warmer tones, more organic lighting, freer camera moves. The third-class passengers are not employed as an exotic background. They're full-fledged characters with dignity and joy. That's not just window dressing, and they're full-fledged. Cameron introduces Rose into this universe and tells us that real life is here. Above. The crisis of the second act starts with Cal's realization of what is going on. It's not an overnight thing. There's a scene where he's looking through the sketches Jack made of Rose, and he picks up one of them. And it's revealing. His countenance betrayed a growing jealousy, which he endeavored to conceal under an affectation of contempt. He's not a fool. He knows what he sees in those drawings. He knows the look Rose gives Jack when she thinks no one is looking. He gave Rose the heart of the ocean. It is calculation, not affection. It's a reminder of her value in the system she lives in, of who she belongs to, and the price of her freedom. Rose accepted the necklace with less than heartfelt thanks, and Cal saw that. Cameron had deliberately made the portrait scene intimate, sensual and narratively daring at the same time. Rose agreed to pose for Jack in the nude, except for the heart of the ocean. She hints at it herself. It's a demand for autonomy. I wear the jewel he gave me, but my body and my choice are mine. Jack looks at her with a respect and attention Cal never gave her, like a person, not a precious object to be protected. When it's done, Rose tucks the portrait away in Cal's safe with a note in her own hand. The message is about something the film doesn't quite reach, but the meaning is perfectly clear. It's a declaration of independence. Then the scene in the Renault, stowed in the ship's hold, surely the most talked about in the film for its audacity in a blockbuster of that era. Rose and Jack consummate their romance in the dark, with the Atlantic rolling beneath them. Cameron shoots the scene with finesse. The more it implies rather than shows, the more emotional rather than merely physical it becomes. It's not the act itself that matters. It's what it symbolizes. Rose has made an irreversible choice. There is no going back. In parallel to the love story, two other narrative elements come into play so gradually that the viewer hardly notices. The first is the velocity of the vessel. Bruce Ismay asking Captain Smith to keep up and even increase the speed to get to New York earlier and make the news. Eventually the captain relents, but not without a struggle. The ship was moving through the Atlantic at 22 knots on a windless, moonless, waveless night, conditions that were, paradoxically, perfect for an iceberg disaster. There were no waves crashing at the base of the ice, so it was virtually impossible to spot them in the dark before it was too late. The second is the evolution of Cal's paranoia. He ordered his valet, Lovejoy, to keep an eye on Rose and report to him what she was about. When Lovejoy tells him about Jack and Rose's antics in the cargo hold, Cal goes cold and contained, a rage far more dangerous than any emotional outburst. He places the heart of the ocean into Jack's coat pocket, then calls security to have him arrested for theft. Jack gets busted. He's handcuffed to a metal pipe in a forgotten corner of the ship, with no escape, while Cal, with chilling calm, tells Rose that the thief is behind bars and everything will be back to normal. And at this point, Jack is trapped in the bowels of the liner. Rose is disoriented and alone in her luxury suite, and Cal is watching her with an owner's gaze. When the ship strikes the iceberg. It was 11:40 p.m. April 14th, 1912. The lookouts in the crow's nest are the first to spot it. Iceberg, dead ahead. The order comes from First Officer Murdoch. Hard a starboard, full astern. But physics is cruel on a 46,000-ton ship going at full speed. The liner attempts to turn. It is not quick enough. The whole side scrapes the iceberg for about 10 seconds, a contact that most passengers don't regard as more frightening than a slight shudder. Most of the people on board had no idea what had happened. Some passengers went up on deck and saw chunks of ice strewn about. They returned to their cabins telling themselves there was nothing to worry about. Thomas Andrews was soon sent for to see the damage under the waterline. He went down with lanterns and tape measures. He returned to the surface half an hour later with an expression which the captain understood instantly without words. Andrews leaned over and whispered to Smith's ear that 5 compartments had been broken into. The ship was divided into watertight compartments and could remain afloat with as many as 4 of these flooded, but with 5 it was simply a question of mathematics. How long before the weight of water would pull the bow down far enough for water to spill over into the other compartments, one after the other? Andrews looked the captain straight in the eye and said what no man in charge of a ship wants to hear. At the latest, the Titanic would go down in 2 hours. 2 hours. That is the difference between 2,224 people and the bottom of the North Atlantic Ocean. Technically speaking, Cameron took these 2 hours of cinema and made one of the most perfect escalations of tension in film history. It is because the viewer knows from the very first second of the movie that the ship is going to sink. No shock there, no surprising twists. The die is cast, the end is unavoidable, and yet every minute in this part of the film just adds to the anxiety. That's the art of storytelling, to create that sense of urgency in the inevitable. Captain Smith, hearing Andrews' verdict, makes an assumption that any prudent captain would make, but under these particular circumstances amounts to condemning hundreds of people to death. He had the boats made ready. And that is when the tragedy of tragedy is revealed to the viewer in all its nature. There were 20 lifeboats on the Titanic. Capacity, 1,178 persons, passengers and crew on board, 2,224. This is not a fictional story. It's not a plot hole. That is a proven historical fact established by the American and British boards of inquiry after the disaster. At the time, Titanic met and exceeded the safety standards for lifeboats, absurd old rules that linked the number of lifeboats to the ship's tonnage and not the number of passengers. Shipbuilding had advanced far beyond the laws, but simple bureaucracy that no one had thought to modernize condemned over 1,000 people to death. Andrews knew it. Smith knew it. And now the viewer knows that slowly the deck is filling with drowsy or dazed passengers, many still believing it's just an excess of caution, that the ship is unsinkable, and they'll be back in their cabins in half an hour. Rose understands the full seriousness of the situation. She had heard Andrew speak. The engineer's silhouette appeared, and then she remembered Jack. Jack is still shackled in the rear of the ship. This is one of the most painful scenes of the close of the second act. It works so well, because Cameron was smart enough to show us a bit earlier that the hole Jack is locked up in is one of the first to flood. The viewer knows this. They know that Rose is running through first-class corridors looking for a key, that Cal's henchmen are blocking her path, that the water is inexorably rising in the lower decks. Jack is down there, trapped below, unable to escape. That's when Cal shows his true colors. Rose asks Cal to let Jack go, and he says no, not from a deliberate malice, but from a combination of wounded pride and class disdain that says more than gratuitous cruelty. Cal does not regard Jack as a threatened human being. He was a chess piece just knocked off the board, and the board itself was about to be discarded. He is already thinking of the lifeboats, already wondering how to save what is his, and what is his is certainly not a young third-class man trussed up in a hold. Then Rose makes a choice that will forever mark her evolution. She resolved to go to the holes alone. The corridors are already giving way to the pressure of the water she runs through. She meets a crew member who accompanies her. She gets him with a sharp mix of authority and urgency and obtains the axe needed to break the handcuffs. By the time she gets to Jack, the water's already up to their knees. This scene destroys one of the most overused cliches in action romance movies. The damsel in distress rescued by the heroic male. Here Rose saves Jack, physically, concretely, axe in hand, water freezing at her ankles. Cameron weaves this into the action, so smoothly into the fabric of the plot, never dwelling too heavily on the symbolism. The subversion is there, but it doesn't have to shout to be heard. Jack is freed, and they finally get back to the deck. But the ship is not the same. The tilt is still minor, 1 or 2 degrees, barely perceptible to most, but revealed by the slight sliding of things. The band continues to play on the first-class deck. One of the most disturbing scenes in the film is based on this historical fact, which has been attested to by many of the tragedy's survivors. Men in tuxedos playing waltzes as the ocean engulfs the deck. It is an image that transcends cinema to become the symbol of a much larger phenomenon, that of a civilization that clung on to keeping up appearances until the end. Preferring music to panic, elegance to chaos, passengers begin to get into the lifeboats. It is here that Cameron, with chilling historical accuracy, lays bare the inequalities that determined who would live and who would die that night. The first-class passengers, each informed separately by the stewards, moved along the right corridors, giving them time and space to comprehend the situation and board the lifeboats in an orderly manner. First-class women and children are first on board. The husbands kiss them goodbye at the boats, looking like people who think everything will be all right, that rescue will come soon, and that deep down it's not that serious. But the third-class passengers are trapped in the belly of the ship, searching for a way out. some of the gates separating the classes. The sanitary control structures required by American immigration laws were locked or blocked by crew members with no apparent orders. Families were caught in corridors as the water level increased. Children scrambled up on their parents' shoulders, searching for stairs to climb up. Cameron is never preachy. Nobody gives long speeches about social injustice. Two pictures, one next to the other. A first-class woman, comfortably seated in a lifeboat, with the assistance of a sailor who knows her name. To decks below, a mother is screaming in a language that none of the crewmen in the corridor seem to understand, pushing two toddlers against an iron gate that won't open. The contrast needs no explanation. The audience understands it without explanation. Amidst this spiraling chaos, Cal makes one last move to hold on to Rose. He gave her a place in the boat, and if she resists, if she says she won't go on without Jack, Cal reaches into his own pocket, pulls out the heart of the ocean, slips it into Jack's coat, and tells an officer that Jack is his associate and must have a place in the same boat. This apparently generous gesture is a pure strategy of reappropriation. He wants to get Rose in the boat, but above all, to make her understand that thanks to his own goodness it was possible. Rose climbed into the boat. The boat started to go down. She looks back at Jack, left on the deck, watching her float away. The camera focuses on him. This is arguably the greatest acting moment of Kate Winslet's career. We see exactly the moment she makes her choice. No inner monologue, no need for words. She gets up, runs back on the deck of the sinking ship, runs up to Jack and says, "You jump." I jump. Cal watches her run back to the ship, rage burning in his eyes. Then, in a scene of pure cold-bloodedness that perfectly defines his character, he takes an officer's gun and runs them down through the flooded corridors of the Titanic. The chase through the corridors with rising water, cracking walls, and the entire structure of the ship groaning under the increasing pressure is a real action movie moment. But Cameron never loses the emotional thread. It never feels like a boring action movie. That is because the viewer never forgets who Jack and Rose are, or what the real stakes of this physical survival are. Cal stops shooting, realizes he's out of bullets. With baffling calm, he tucks the gun back into his waistband, adjusts his coat, and goes to look for a lifeboat for himself. He uses a crying little girl he found on deck to fake being her father to get a spot on a boat reserved for families. This last act leaves the character undressed. There is no possibility of redemption, no humanity whatsoever. And Cal Hockley left the Titanic the only way he knew how, with lies, with guile. And the weakest as nothing but a tool. The heart of the ocean is in the pocket of the coat he gave to Jack. And Cal gets this when he reaches into his pocket and feels only empty lining. The look on his face tells us more about him than any dialogue could. The ship is now leaning at more than 15 degrees. The bow bows down. The forward decks are fully underwater. The stern rises and lifts slowly out of the ocean. And on the deck, in the midst of hundreds of people praying, crying, holding each other and saying goodbye, Jack keeps a firm hold of Rose's hand. At 2:20 a.m. on April 15, 1912, the RMS Titanic had disappeared entirely beneath the waters of the North Atlantic. It was 2 hours and 40 minutes from the moment of contact with the iceberg until she sank out of sight. And with such attention to historical detail in the final scene, Cameron was able to persuade researchers and survivors of the sinking, though still living when the film was released, that it was the most accurate recreation ever captured on film. Every phase of the ship's descent was painstakingly reconstructed from official investigations, the accounts of survivors, and subsequent studies of the shipwreck, including Cameron's own dives to the ocean floor with a camera, For the last 45 minutes of the movie, the viewer is, technically, watching a disaster unfold in slow motion. The ship doesn't go down immediately. It dies little by little. Cameron captures the disintegration of a world in all its detail, and that makes it far more disturbing than the spectacle it could so easily have been. When Jack and Rose make it to the stern, the bow has already sunk beneath the water. The deck was black with people who could not get a lifeboat, third-class passengers who had arrived too late, first-class men who gave up their places to their wives, crewmen who stayed to the end out of a sense of duty, musicians who played until the water was at their ankles. Cameron doesn't see them as just a crowd. The camera lingers on several faces. An elderly couple climbs into bed as water fills their cabin. A mother cradles her two small children and tells them a story. She knows there will be no tomorrow. The waters are rushing in and Captain Smith locks himself up alone in the bridge. These are scenes without words, and they don't need any. The stern rises slowly. The tilt is increasing rapidly. 10 degrees, 15, 20 degrees. Things are sliding across the deck. People are hanging onto railings, onto fixtures, onto each other. The liner creaks on every joint, a sound described by survivors as the worst they had ever heard. The screaming of metal under incredible pressure. Unable to take the colossal forces of such torque. Cameron shot these scenes with real actors on a real set that was really tilting. The massive hydraulic structure built for just this purpose. No camera tricks. When the deck was 45 degrees on screen, the physical set was indeed 45 degrees. The actors you see clinging to grates and sliding down the deck were actually sliding, hiding safety harnesses under their costumes, and rescue teams were standing by to intervene just out of the camera's frame. Then the ship's hull splits in half. This is one of the most violent scenes in the film, but also one of the most historically accurate. For decades after the 1912 tragedy, the official story was that the Titanic sank in one piece, gracefully going down. The truth was only discovered after the wreck was located in 1985, and it was discovered that the bow and stern were separated by hundreds of meters. The ship had in fact split into on the surface, probably when the stern was tilted between 10 and 20 degrees. Cameron brings this fact on screen to devastating effect. The crash of the failing structure, the two halves separating, the stern briefly falling back to the horizontal before sinking in turn. Jack and Rose survive the sinking of the hull, clinging to a floating piece of the ship as the liner disappears into the depths. One of the most moving shots in the feature is when the Titanic vanishes under the waves, its huge propeller emerging from the ocean for the last time, and the lights flickering and dying one by one as the generators fail. No music, just the sounds of water, metal, and distant screams, and then nothing else. There are people in the ocean, hundreds of people in life jackets, floating, screaming, calling out, begging the boats pulling away for help. The water was below 2 degrees Celsius. In water that cold, a healthy person will lose consciousness in less than 15 minutes and die of hypothermia in less than half an hour. The lifeboats heard the screams, and they did not budge, but not all. Some of the men in the small boats tried to get the others to go back and pick up the men left in the water, but most refused, fearful the boat would swamp under the weight of the clamoring crowd. These arguments were documented in official inquiries and survivor testimonies. Cameron plays this moment very soberly. One of these arguments erupts in a boat, Molly Brown demanding to turn back, to no avail. It's not the point of the scene, but it's there, historical, brutal. Jack and Rose are in the water. Rose saw in the debris a piece of driftwood, a piece of decorative wood paneling torn from the ship, big enough for one person. She climbs on top of it. Jack, for his part, tries to climb up, but the panel breaks under their combined weight. Jack remains in the water, holding on to the edge, while Rose remains above. This brings us to the point which has raised, and still excites, more hot discussion than any other. The matter of the door. Could the two of them get in? James Cameron has had to respond to this question in public so many times he has finally stopped being diplomatic. In a 2012 interview celebrating the 20th anniversary of the film, he makes his final word crystal clear. The only reason Jack didn't get on that door is because I needed him to die. It was a screenwriting choice, not an engineering problem. In 2023, a scientific study started on the TV show Mythbusters and later in a National Geographic special, which Cameron himself participated in, proved that under certain specific balance conditions, both characters could have been saved by tying their life jackets under the board to increase its buoyancy. But Cameron took the experiment in stride. They might have made it, he said, but then there wouldn't have been a movie. That's a good answer. It makes an important point about the very nature of the film Titanic. Jack's death is not a logical or narrative flaw. It's a very intentional decision that serves the emotional and thematic goals of the piece. If there was a happy ending to the story, Rose and Jack's love would have never reached so deep. The meaning is tragedy. The point of the story is loss. Jack stayed in the freezing water for long minutes, talking to Rose, without losing hope. A soothing calm, the same calm that had defined him since the very first scene. He makes her promise to live, to have a long and happy life, to have children and grandchildren, to die an old lady, warm in her bed and not in this freezing water. Rose promises him. Then the cold does its deadly work. The moment of Jack's death. No music, no sappy tears, just an increasingly heavy silence, eyes closing, fingers slowly releasing Rose's hand, is one of the finest performances of DiCaprio's entire career. Because he doesn't play death, he plays fade away. It is a subtle nuance, but a heart-wrenching one. No grand, dramatic collapse. There is only a face that gradually loses consciousness, like a light whose brightness fades until it is extinguished. Rose finally releases his hand. She watches his body sink in the black water. Then she hears a whistle. A lifeboat is coming back at last. She blows a whistle off a dead officer to catch her attention. She was rescued. She lived. The final sequence, back in the present, closes the loop in a narratively graceful and emotionally overwhelming manner. "Tell me about the diamond," said Lovett to Rose. She opens her palm. The heart of the ocean is there. She carried it with her for 84 years without telling anyone, without having to sell it, without donning it, just having it. And instead of handing it back to Lovett, she walks to the railing of the exploration ship, right over the North Atlantic, where it all happened, and drops the diamond into the ocean. She hands it back. That night, she returns it to where it belongs, not to a museum, not to a vault, but to the bottom of the sea, where Jack lies. The very last scene brings the Titanic back to life. Its sparkling lights and passengers swarming the corridors, Jack waiting for Rose by the grand staircase, exactly as in the portrait. All those who died that night cheering them on. Rose asleep, dying or dreaming. Of course. How each viewer interprets this conclusion is up to the viewer. Dead. A dream, memory. Cameron never answered back. This ambiguity is deliberate. The thing that matters is not what happens literally, but what it means emotionally. Rose was alive. She had a fine time. Did she say so? And she kept it. The ship went under the waves. But their love didn't. There's a reason why Titanic doesn't. Age. Like most blockbusters, the visual effects that 90s action movies used to impress the audience eventually age over time. The effects that seemed so amazing at the time reveal their limitations decades later, and all that remains is a technological illusion. Watching the 1997 Titanic today, one is struck by how dated some of the visual effects look, but the movie works with the same emotional power. It will make people weep still. It remains one of the greatest films ever made. That's because the movie is based on things that don't get old ideas. Cameron managed to weave into the fabric of an epic entertainment film universal themes that have been explored throughout centuries of literature and art, that never feeling preachy. The most obvious theme, so obvious you can't miss it, is the theme of social class as a prison. The real Titanic was a floating metaphor of Edwardian society, a society that believed deeply in the natural hierarchy of human beings. Some are born to command, to live in luxury and to occupy the upper decks, others to serve, to stoke the boilers, and to remain imprisoned in the ship's belly. Such was the strength of this belief that even when disaster struck, the hierarchical order was still respected, even in the face of death. First-class passengers had much higher survival rates. It wasn't that someone intended to let the poor die, but that the system was set up so that the rich got priority. What Cameron saw, and what speaks for itself, is an image of a padlocked iron gate that separated the third-class corridors from the stairs that led to the lifeboats. The camera holds on this gate just long enough to make it clear to the viewer what it stands for. It's not a villain in the story who closed this gate. It's the system. It's the organization. It is the way things are supposed to work, as they are supposed to work, until it becomes impossible to deny that this way of working is not just Jack and Rose are two bodies moving in opposite directions through this structure. Jack rises physically, literally, from the steerage of the ship to the posh first-class lounges, not because the system allowed him to, but because Rose made a breach for him. Rose, meanwhile, descends from the society lounges to the lower decks, exchanging convention for freedom, not because the system let her down, but because she judged the price of remaining in it to high. The exchange is the engine of the film's narrative. This symbolism does not end with the two protagonists. The ship is symbolic in itself. The Titanic was at the time the height of human engineering, the biggest, the fastest, the most luxurious and the safest. It was the progress in steel and the arrogance of it, blind faith in man's power to conquer nature, the ocean to make the impossible possible, and the sea responded in 3 hours. There is something quintessentially human about this story that goes beyond the particular tragedy of 1912 and touches something archetypal. The story of hubris, the story of arrogance inviting a fall. We see the same idea in the story of Icarus flying too close to the sun, in Oedipus trying to escape his fate, and in countless other stories that humanity has been telling itself for millennia. Cameron knew he was working in this tradition. The Titanic is more than a ship. It is the symbol of every time humanity thought itself invincible and found itself in the heart of the ocean to be the most sophisticated symbol in the film. On the surface, it's just a priceless piece of jewelry. The narrative MacGuffin driving Brock Lovett in the present and tying together the scripts to timelines. But on a deeper level, this blue diamond gathers meanings throughout the film with incredible meticulous. Kel gives it to Rose as a means of control. It's a show of strength. I can buy you anything you want. What could you possibly need that I couldn't give you? It's a jewel that looks like a gift, but is a veritable chain. But when Rose poses for Jack with the heart of the ocean, the meaning is turned on its head. The jewel still hangs around her neck, but in the context of a choice Cal would never approve of an intimate moment that no amount of money in the world could buy. Now Cal's jewel is in Jack's drawing, his symbol of domination is etched in the very image of his defeat. And at the end of the film, when Rose throws the diamond into the ocean, the act is almost ritualistic. She had almost 100 years to do this and never sold it. She could have easily made an incalculable fortune from it. She kept it, not for its value, but because it was the last physical link she had to that night, to Jack, to the woman she'd been on that ship, closing the circle, sending back to the bottom of the sea, where it all began, the very last thing that survived the night. The clothing and color choices in the film also have a subtler, but just as rich, symbolism for most of the first act and the beginning of the second. Rose is dressed in cool colors, blues, pale greens. In the classic visual language of cinema, these tones mean restriction, distance, control. The colors warm as she draws closer to Jack, when she is on the deck with him at sunset, when she dances with the third-class passengers, when she poses for the portrait. There is a new chromatic warmth. Jack, from the first minutes, is dressed in neutral or warm colors. For him, there is no chromatic transition, for he is not in transition. He is the man he is from the beginning. But Rose is the one who is changing, and the wardrobe tells that story in perfect accordance with the script. Finally, time and memory as themes give the film a far more complex structure than a mere plot. The old Rose is not a storyteller. She does an act of resurrection. She brings these people back to life with her words. Jack, Andrews, Molly Brown, Captain Smith, all those who died. The only place the Titanic lives on, as it was, alive, vibrant, teeming with life, is in Rose's memories, and, by sharing that memory with Lovett and his team, she passes the burden along. Her story will not be lost with her. It will survive. Then the film poses one of the most delicate questions about the very art of storytelling. Like Rose's memory, cinema is a resurrection. It is a technology that keeps the past alive and enables generations who never knew these people to feel who they really were. Cameron knew that well enough when he put that narrative frame around it. And in making Rose the keeper of history, he tells us that the most important stories are not the ones that the historians carefully archive, but the ones that ordinary people keep buried in them. There is a theme in every frame of this film. Although it is rarely explicitly discussed, the brevity of time as an amplifier of meaning. Jack and Rose are only together for a few days, not weeks, not months, a couple of days. Normally a 3-day fling between two young adults would be nothing more than an insignificant detail, a simple vacation romance, an ephemeral encounter. But it is precisely the tragedy that surrounds them that makes these few days a love story for the ages. Death was close, if the characters were not consciously aware of it, and it gave every second the intensity that ordinary moments lack. This was something Cameron understood in a way that transcends the mechanics of storytelling. He knew that love was not diminished by brevity. On the contrary, sometimes it makes it memorable. And Rose, who lived another 90 years after the Titanic, bore the weight of those few days within her as more significant than the rest of her long existence. That is why at the very end of the film, she is not thinking about her children or her grandchildren, not even the decades Jack never had. She remembers that night, to that craft, onto that plank of wood in the water, for they were the times she had felt most alive. The real philosophical heart of Titanic is the notion that life is not measured in years, but in intensity, in presence, in those fleeting moments when one is perfectly awake to the world around them. That's what Jack means, not only for Rose, but for the audience. It reminds us that our time is limited, and it is not how long we will live, but how we will live that matters. There is a song that can, from the first notes of the Irish flute, take you to a darkened movie theater, smelling the popcorn, with a heavy heart, and the intimate certainty that what you just saw will mark you forever. That is no overstatement. That is a psychological phenomenon that has been documented. The power of a melody to emotionally anchor, to link a sound so intimately to an experience that the two become inseparable. And with Titanic, this happened on a scale no composer or producer could have foreseen. But before we get to talking about Celine Dion and My Heart Will Go On, we have to tell the story of this score that almost wasn't what it is. In order to do that, we need to take a look at the relationship between James Cameron and composer James Horner, a collaboration with a loaded past, unresolved tensions, that was rebuilt to become legendary in the world of film music. James Horner had collaborated with Cameron before on Aliens 1986, and it had been no fun at all, either one of them. Deadlines were tight, squabbles common, and Horner departed the project convinced Cameron was an incredibly gifted but terribly difficult director. In fact, the two men remained estranged for 10 years. Doc Cameron was the one who called Horner when he was thinking about the music for Titanic. This wasn't a random pick. Cameron knew Horner had a rare gift for making music that was a real emotional narrative. It told the story of the scene without overloading it, supporting the dramatic weight without trying to compete with it. Cameron also said that the Celtic and folk sounds that Horner often used were just what the film needed, giving it a sense of vastness, melancholy, and something elusive, as if from a very distant time. Horner agreed to take it on, and by both their accounts they worked a lot better together than in the Aliens days. It was intense, very demanding, but with much better communication about each other's expectations. The Titanic score is very complex technically. Horner built a score that blended 3 different sound layers: a classical orchestral bass, played by the Hollywood Studio Symphony, traditional Celtic and Irish instruments like the tin whistle or uilleann pipes, and a 3rd layer of a digitally synthesized choir. On some tracks Horner chose a synthesized choir instead of a real human choir, a technical choice that gave the music that ethereal, almost unearthly texture that defined the film's entire sonic identity. Norwegian singer Sissel Kyrkjebø, known simply as Sissel, was hired to provide the Celtic vocalizations heard throughout the piece. Sissel's voice is heard in the film's quietest and most melancholic moments. When the camera glides over the wreckage, when Rose looks out at the liner's horizon, or when silence slowly reclaims the drowned corridors, a voice that is both human and spiritual, which Horner inserted with great dramatic precision. And then we have My Heart Will Go On. The story of how this song was conceived and how it almost didn't make the film is one of the wildest behind-the-scenes tales of Titanic, and that's saying a lot. Given the competition, James Cameron was insistent that his movie not have a pop song. His stance had been unambiguous and consistent from the start. He'd seen too many films in the 80s and 90s where a pop song was jammed into the end credits for commercial reasons or album sales, not dramatic necessity. Cameron didn't want that to happen to the Titanic. He wanted the musical experience to be cohesive, for Horner's score to be with the viewer right to the end of the screening, with no outside intrusion. Horner, however, had the exact opposite thought. He saw it as an opportunity to create a piece that would be the dramatic climax of the work and a standalone piece, extending the Titanic experience far beyond the cinema. But he also knew Cameron wouldn't be easy to convince. So he took a chance. He went on his own, without telling the director. Horner took the film's main theme, that famous flute melody played from the earliest scenes with Rose, and which recurs repeatedly throughout the narrative, and went to lyricist Will Jennings. They wrote a whole song around it together, Then Hon asked Celine Dion, then one of the biggest international stars, thanks to a string of hits, to record a demo. Hon promised her the recording would be kept secret. The singer nodded. In one studio session that only took a few hours, she recorded vocals for what would become the demo for My Heart Will Go On. Diane said she knew it was a working version, but knowing if it would lead to anything. But her performance was instantly a masterclass in emotional delivery. I sang that song, knowing it was a demo, and it sounded amazing, she said later. Hon tucked the demo under his arm and went to see Cameron. He heard that, and he didn't like that. Different accounts exist, but all agree the first conversation afterwards was incredibly tense. Again, the director was insistent. He did not want a pop song in his film, but Hon would not be denied. He asked him to play it again, but this time lay the music over the footage, especially the end credits dot, so Cameron listened again, eyes on the monitor, and he had a change of heart, he had to admit. The music was so fitting with the pictures. The melody, made up of themes from the film itself, was perfect for the emotions, for the viewer who just spent 3 hours inside the work soundscape. This end credits song would serve as a sort of summary of all that they just experienced. It was the end and the beginning of the story. Here the image stopped. The words started. Cameron nodded. They had just put My Heart Will Go On into the movie. The track was released as a single internationally on November 24, 1997, and became a historic success. In the United States, it went straight to number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100 upon release, where it remained for 2 weeks, and it dominated the Hot Adult Contemporary Tracks chart for 10 weeks. It reached number 1 on almost every chart it appeared on, including the Eurochart Hot 100 singles for 17 weeks, Switzerland for 15 weeks, and France and Germany for 13 consecutive weeks. The song sold over 2 million copies in Germany. In the UK, sales topped 1.3 million copies. The song went on to sell over 1.2 million copies in France. It was the best-selling single of 1998 worldwide, and quickly rose to the top of the best-selling records in music history. My Heart Will Go On won an Oscar for Best Original Song at the 1998 Academy Awards. And talking about the soundtrack, it won the statuette for Best Original Dramatic Score, giving James Horner 2 trophies, a rare recognition for a composer in a single ceremony. James Horner was killed in a plane crash in California in June 2015. He was 61 years old. Titanic is generally thought to be his best-known and most admired piece of work, a soundtrack that has crossed generations, and still does, as young people who never saw the film come across the melody, hear it in passing, and feel an emotion impossible to articulate. And that is the hallmark of great soundtracks to serve a film, but know how to exist without it. There is, however, a part of the Titanic soundtrack that is often forgotten, the diegetic music, or the music that exists in the film's universe, and that the characters can hear as well. The little orchestra that plays in the first-class corridors, Gaelic Storm, the Irish band, at the third-class passengers' lively party, including the track Jack and Rose Dance too, but the greatest of all, without doubt, the musicians playing on the deck as the ship sinks into the water. The latter choice is based on unquestionable historical facts confirmed by a great number of survivors. It is true that Wallace Hartley and his band of 8 played on the Titanic's outer deck as the ship sank. It was their own initiative, not a command from the leadership. They could have got into a boat, but they chose to stay playing. There was none. Cameron uses this historical scene to raise it above the dramatic, to hint at an archetype. That art, even in the face of the most inescapable death, is vital. That the continuing to make music is that last great human thing no disaster can ever entirely take away. It's hard to hear the hymn the band played in its final moments, "Nearer, my God, to Thee," decades later without a profound sense of gravity. The film uses it with such power. When James Cameron announced his intention to recreate the sinking of the Titanic with the utmost historical accuracy, he faced a major technical challenge that no other director had yet been able to overcome. How could he film the sinking of such a huge ship of a way that looks truly credible on screen? The question appears trivial. It's not. In other films that have tackled the subject, most famously 1958's A Night to Remember, a well-known shortcut was used, filming scale models in slow motion, then speeding up the footage in post-production to give the impression of movement on the scale of a giant ship. The trick is that water doesn't behave like a real ocean when it's filmed in slow motion and then sped up. How waves form, how bubbles connect on the surface, how the watery mirror responds to the titanic weight of a metal building. All of these qualities obey laws of physics that cannot be faked by the trick of fast playback. And on screen this was obvious to experts and to the general public. You quickly saw that the water gave away the deception. It was a trap Cameron could not afford to fall into. It was therefore a technique that combined three totally opposite methods, used strategically according to the strict needs of each shot. The first level was to trust the model, but this was not a simple wooden model. To illustrate the sinking process, and to do justice to some wide angles that show the entire wreck in one frame, Cameron's visual effects company, Digital Domain, co-founded in 1993, built scale miniature replicas of the ship. The main model was 7.5 meters long, which is a huge model, but just perfect for shooting in good conditions. The detail work on these models was so advanced, it was the same as the real ship itself. Grained metal, windows, hand-painted INSIG and IAS ... So the model recording really got revolutionized by motion control. It's a filming system, automated by the computer, that allows to control the movement of the camera with millimeter precision and repeat the same path indefinitely. This solved an inherent need of the final composite. The camera shooting the model had to move in very complicated geometric paths, so that when CGI was added, all parameters would merge together like one block. The second major process was the use of computer-generated imagery, CGI, and this particular moment is a turning point, arguably a before and after for special effects cinema, of course. Digital Domain had designed synthetic visual tools to simulate the ocean water before. The company had used them on documentaries, but the film would need a masterly effort far beyond anything done before. Visual effects specialist Robert Legotto's team was able to set parameters to reproduce the true nature of water in very short dive times. Calculations quickly simulated the swelling motions expanding to cover immense structures, how the displacement of mass pressed upon the ocean, or what shape this great foam took around partially submerged surfaces. These methods were rendered on then state-of-the-art computers that took endless hours to render mere fractions of raw seconds. So you have to understand the visual gulf between the poverty of computer-generated visuals decades before. It was no longer a simple rendering of foam obtained with 2 clicks, but an environment whose structure was governed by mathematical formulas rigorously based on nautical physics, fully processed and controlled by the computing specific to the production company. We admired the water, but it was 100% realistically treated. It obeyed mindlessly the fundaments of the physical formulary of our Earth, but digitally recreating the stormy seas was just half the story. The Black Ruin had to show. Its population, hundreds of them had to be sketched all along the deck, by the railings, plunging headlong into the fathomless void, floating against the wreck. In these scenarios, in almost all the sequences shot with heavy aerial rigs or extreme wide shots of the structure, it was physically impossible to put extras so sparsely. So the use of digital stunt doubles, which the industry greeted with understandable amazement at the time, was all dictated by the imaging company. Industry-wise, they are technically called digital extras, their digital ergonomics having been developed by pioneers in the field thanks to the rather austere harnessing of bodily movements in the pre-2000 era, what would later be called motion capture. In the years that followed, the actors would put a bunch of tracking dots on their faces and do gestures that a computer would then copy directly to make 3D wireframe models of each of them. It was spectacular to see the progress. Hundreds of men and women moved so naturally, so realistically, when the frames frantically showed the stampedes on a deck, the drownings in the swell, or the distress expressed by them holding onto the ebony wood of the structure. In a frozen frame, anyone would see a computer glitch and resolution of the time. But there you have it. In a feature film, the occasional rhythmic blurs alternating with the striking humanity of the real actor captured in the foreground. I was fooled. The design team also managed to virtually extend the giant studio to accommodate the giant liner built near Rosarito. It is seen in many scenes of the film silhouetted against a sunset in its entirety. This seems physically impossible nowadays, given the semi-finished structure built for this purpose by Mexican workers on land. At these very moments, the concrete silhouette is visible in the closest shots, while the miracle of the visual creativity of the system rebuilds a masterfully balanced building, so tricking our perception of an architecture we would all swear was authentically constructed out of one piece of wood and scrap metal at its base. But it is more surprising to those who are prepared to hear strange particulars. To prevent the actor from freezing while filming, exterior heights of the ship made sense. Recall the temperature was barely above zero during the tragedy, and yet, with the weather conditions of Central America, note, source text said South America, adjusting literal translation, Central, North America, Mexico. Not one of them could logically exhale that cottony cloud from a nostril. The freezing seaside climate is the reason for the foggy breath effect. Then a studio called VIFX was brought in, hired specifically to add visual trails of a freezing halo coming from the mouth to these shots, in an incredibly time-consuming process, frame by frame, while the extra was shot in contact with these arctic voids of the script. This is a minor feat of filigree work that no conscience will truly equate to pure entertainment, but that our own brains will logically pause for a brief instant of resonance. These trails of air-breathed out scream to the viewer's instinctual mechanism, the fateful reality of a freezing sea... asking us to understand the mortal distress about the idyllic Mexican setting beyond the frame, forcing the cinephile to physically suffer in echo with their counterparts through a tiny, invisible post-edit edition that made a colossal difference in the visual immersion mechanism. But if wonders have a name, any visual effects analyst will surely put at the top of the podium this masterful performance obtained at the 11th hour in the ultimate climax. We literally see the giant block of a liner fly straight up into the air at the end, before the structure is definitively buried underwater. The brief moment in which the vision retreats in silence to impose upon the viewer the cataclysmic scale of the scene in a black composition. A shot at the incredible intersection of all the expertise mentioned. At this precise phase, tilted structure, modeling with that famous cinematic motion control, virtual stunning extensions, all of which were balanced in long editing sessions of post-production, and the applause was totally expected during the ceremonies. Robert Legato, who had taken on all the roles of the design group, got the Oscar honoring these efforts at the 98 Golden Trophies, a prize divided and warmly won by faces absolutely decisive to the whole. MTH won, Lassoff, Elle Fisher and co-worker Michael Kampfer, as he often does in artistic circles. When giving speeches after a film, Legato didn't miss the chance to talk about his ultimate weapon that enabled them to reach the Holy Grail, computers, not as a mere substitute for traditional tools of the trade, but artfully integrated in symbiosis with them. There is a sense of a postulate of Cameron's here, one he'd worked on for ages in previous narratives. With all the demand the man was known for, let's not forget the dizzying accomplishments, meeting expectations on a colossal scale. Throughout this 3-hour epic, to step outside the sole dimension of CGI visual art achievements, the set decoration team, led by Chief Peter Lamont, who has written a myriad of the most dazzling and famous visual effects since his time under the banner of James Bond blockbusters, managed to pay an unparalleled tribute through this meticulous rescue of a first-class set via long sessions on parchment near the Harland and Wolff builders, all enhanced, of course, through the real surviving photos of that inaugural voyage. No expense was spared, and from the smallest extracted relic, the design was executed in 3 dimensions, unmatched in cinema. The statuette would also recognize the achievement for Best Art Direction, a well-deserved clean sweep. Then it was time for artist and award-winning designer Deborah Lynn Scott to do a brilliant job executing all the architecture surrounding the wardrobe that also couldn't escape an end-of-run award. And this, not without long days, dusting off authentic registers of Edwardian fashion commerce to give the viewer the expected presence during luxurious evenings or for the commoners drinking between 2 holds on distant decks. The distinction of the everyday, fabric, scissor cuts and finery, from immaculate luxury to the most precarious rags, an abyss boldly presented in its disparity. Clothing in every shot was a glaring tool to reflect the fierce politics of classism this world imposed. Everything was done carefully, to the millimeter. Russell Carpenter, a quality who by the way deserved the Oscar for Best Cinematography, was mentioned, of course. The visual feel he gave the director's script feels quite textbook today, but was largely unparalleled when it exploded onto the big screen. It is quickly set up against the close-up intimacy of a handful of actors in the brewing storm, through long takes blended with wide pans, in which the visual makes the giant aspect of the sea vessel physically felt, by their fiercely anchored decision to keep a natural horizon instead of the usual cardboard canvas of the blockbusters of the period, giving an unprecedented level of reality with no escape or failing post-studio illusion. We identified the stroke of the completed orchestrator. Finally, the sound mixing industry is to be recognized with all these cinematic distinctions that have been earned in a handful of famous awards: Best Sound Editing on the one hand and Best Sound Mixing on the other. Alas, they have been kept much too far from the spotlight of the popular media for the cinephile accustomed to glitter. This is the basis of the representation of the last throes of foul noises, sheet metal, friction with the unbearable creaking of a maritime impact, screaming corridors that pierce the endless deluge. We recall, as a point of ingenuity, it was nothing less than the audacity of replaying a real full-scale test through water and sound pressure experiments to recreate those tailor-made chills according to the evolution of the ship until the inevitable final drama. Bearing this in mind, what to make of this boundless and surely non-reducible combination of colossal amounts of artificial wooden architecture, motion control, CGI digital extras gasping for air in post-production, all in symbiosis with artists achieving historically flawless period sound. The most staggering cinematic birth ever produced and virtually without equal, reproducible even today in such a virtuoso manner, as the financial intersection of talent and passionate fervor that formed the soul of this superwork Titanic will logically see few returns in industry textbooks. Venerable organizations, justly and on all levels related to American academic circles, like the ancient Cinematic Honors Center, the National Board of Review, offered the film this non-trivial consecration under their letters of praise, as an unparalleled recognition in more traditional formats, attesting that James Cameron only went beyond his art with the film of the moment, but more so made history, purely disrupting the cinematic ecosystem, with an absolute knockout blow asserting himself as a definitive mutation of pure creative expression. Titanic was released in theaters throughout the US on December 19, 1997. Thus began one of the greatest box office stories ever, manufactured by the entertainment industry. In the US, the film grossed $28.6 million on its opening weekend, Thursday to Sunday, from 2,674 screens, not enough to soothe the Fox and Paramount executives, still scarred by articles comparing the project to Waterworld. It was a modest debut for a $200 million film. The math was simple. At this rate, it would take months for the movie to break even on its production cost, let alone its marketing cost, usually half the production cost for a movie of that size. But what transpired over the ensuing weeks flouted all of Hollywood's conventions. Titanic, the movie, did not sink. It made more than the first in its second week, even more in the third week. The film experienced its weekly high in its fourth weekend, which included Christmas and New Year's, two of the biggest days for American cinema, with over $35 million in a single weekend. Months after it hit theaters, it was still in the top 5 most watched films weekly in America. This phenomenon, called legs by box office analysts, meaning a film's ability to hold its performance over weeks, not just crash after the opening weekend, was so extreme with Titanic, it became a case study in business schools and entertainment marketing courses. The movie's multiplier, its theatrical hold in the domestic market, was 19.02, which means total American grosses were 19 times greater than its largest individual weekend. That's a crazy number. To give you an idea, most action blockbusters have multipliers that hover around to 2.4. That was nothing new, and a very simple reason for it. People were coming back. It wasn't just new audiences coming in the weeks following. It was the same audience coming back, sometimes with somebody, sometimes alone, sometimes for the third or fourth time. And in the audience interviews of the day, the answer was always the same. I had to see it again. My mother wanted to go and see it. Cried so hard the first time I missed half the movie. It was a movie that inspired a desire to rewatch it, something that Hollywood rarely experienced, and when it did, it was for cult movies, not $300 million epics. The day Titanic came out didn't make the most money. It was about 2 months after the launch, on Valentine's Day, February 14, 1998. Here's a statistic that proves better than any other how this film played. It was the perfect Valentine's Day event, a cinematic gift to couples, a shared emotional experience that people wanted to share together on special dates. Titanic grossed $600 million in the US and Canada by the end of its original run in American theaters. Even more spectacular was the international box office, $1.24 billion in its first run. The original release brought in $1.84 billion worldwide. That total made Titanic the first film in history to cross the billion-dollar mark at the global box office, and it did so with room to spare, becoming the first to cross $1.5 billion. It was the highest-grossing film of all time for 12 years until Cameron's other film, Avatar, took the crown in 2010. The film has grossed $2.264 billion at the box office, including the 2012 3D version, the 2023 25th anniversary re-release, and other smaller theatrical runs, which makes it James Cameron's second highest grossing film and one of the biggest in history, especially considering how much more purchasing power 1997 money had compared to today. When adjusted for inflation to today's dollars, the US domestic box office alone is over $1.55 billion. The film grossed $70 million across its releases in Brazil, a market that has never been neglected by Cameron, and one that has some of the most loyal audiences in the world for grand cinematic epics, making it the third highest grossing film of all time in the country. In terms of critical reception professionally, it was mostly positive, but not all of it. On Rotten Tomatoes, the film holds an approval rating of 87% based on 52 reviews. With an average rating of 8/10, the consensus from the platform is a mostly unqualified triumph for James Cameron, who delivers a dizzying mix of spectacular visuals and old-fashioned melodrama. Metacritic gives the film a score of 75 out of 100, indicating generally favorable reviews. The film has a 7.9 out of 10 rating on IMDb, where votes from the audience are weighted heavily. Based on more than 1 million reviews, all the critics who raved about the film were agreed on two things: the unprecedented technical scale of the production and the emotional effectiveness of the storytelling. It was awarded 4 out of 4 stars and included in the pantheon of great films by Roger Ebert, the most influential American film critic of his generation. Cameron had made one of the truly great epic films in the history of cinema, one that put all the technology at its disposal in the service of a universally touching human story, Ebert declared. But there were repeated criticisms from those not entirely convinced by the film. Comments were most often about the dialogue, particularly in the romantic scenes in the first and second acts, which were viewed as conventional and predictable by some. Others said that Jack and Rose were more archetypes than real people, the uninhibited young man free from social constraints, versus the young woman bound by convention, and that Cameron hadn't done enough to give them the nuance that would have made them fully three-dimensional. To some extent, this is a valid criticism. Jack Dawson does have very few visible flaws. He is almost entirely an ideal, a mirror upon which Rose and the viewer projects their desires. But one can argue, and many critics and film scholars have in the years since, that this is exactly what the character needed to be for the narrative structure of the film. Jack is not a man, he is an idea, the notion of freedom. Epic films are a long tradition of characters as embodiments of ideas, not as complex psychological explorations. The most clear clash of critical response was between art house critics and mainstream cinema critics. A clear division in the trade press of 1997, European art house or independent film publications took a somewhat skeptical view of Titanic, a formulaic Hollywood epic wrapped in overpriced special effects. Was a fairly good summary of some of these takes, but it was received with near unanimous enthusiasm by mainstream and blockbuster cinema journals. The truth, as always, was somewhere in the middle, and the Oscars were a good thermometer for that reality. The Academy was very generous with the film in the technical categories, but Leonardo DiCaprio's lack of a Best Actor award was glaring, an omission still cited today as one of the biggest mistakes of the ceremony. given the crucial importance of that performance to the emotional functioning of the entire film. Meanwhile, it was Winslet's second Oscar nomination for Best Actress. The first was in 1996 for Sense and Sensibility, and she lost to Helen Hunt for As Good as It Gets, a loss which seems increasingly surprising to those who revisit the two performances in question over the years. The numbers and the reviews together tell the same story. A film that did something very rare in the film world. It was both a mass phenomenon and a technically perfect work, loved by everyone with an almost irrational intensity and respected by industry pros for its directorial prowess. It wasn't an art house film in the strict sense. Cameron never said it was. But it was not empty entertainment either. There were ideas and ambition, and a technical and an emotional mastery that separated it from most of the products of its time. It was above all a film that moved people. And what other measure of success can matter more in the end than that? On the night of March 23, 1998, James Cameron appeared on the stage of the Shrine Auditorium in Los Angeles for the 11th time that evening. When they announced its name, the presenters looked tired. It had won so much: Best Sound Editing, Best Sound Mixing, Best Direction of Art, Best Costume Design, Best Cinematography, Best Original Score Dramatic, Original Song the Best Special Effects, Best Editing, Director, Best, and finally, Best Picture. Our Academy Awards, 14 times nominated. Its 14 nominations tied the all-time record for most Oscar nominations received by a single film in one ceremony. Set in 1950 by All About Eve, with 11 Oscars, it tied 1959's Ben-Hur, which held the record for most wins by a single film in Academy history. These two records for nominations and wins would remain unbroken until 2003, when The Lord of the Rings, The Return of the King matched the 11 Oscars, with 11 nominations instead of 14. This record number of nominations would be broken in 2026, when Sinners reaches 15. The range of this list of 11 wins is impressive. Academy Awards, including Best Picture, Best Director, Best Cinematography, Best Art Direction, Best Costume Design, Best Original Dramatic Score, Best Original Song, Best Sound Editing, Best Sound Mixing, Best Visual Effects and Best Film Editing. The three nominations that didn't win were Best Actress Kate Winslet, Best Supporting Actress Gloria Stewart, and Best Makeup. One of the most talked about Oscar debates of the year, and still ongoing, is the absence of a Best Actor nomination for Leonardo DiCaprio, who carried the film and still got snubbed. The Academy, in that mysterious way it would continue to do for decades, skipped over DiCaprio that occasion, until he finally got the statuette for The Revenant in 2016. But this snub at the 1998 Oscars is one of the most memorable absences in the history of the ceremony. Cameron walked to the stage to accept the last award of the night, Best Picture. When he held the statuette aloft, looked out at the audience and screamed, "I'm the king of the world." The same line Jack Dawson screams in the bow scene of Titanic, arms spread wide, facing the wind. It was a moment of total triumph, perhaps over much in the eyes of some, but a perfect mirror of Cameron's journey through this project. From a director whose sanity had been publicly questioned for risking everything on a $300 million epic what he wanted to finance, to the man who had just defeated all his detractors so soundly that he could afford the luxury of quoting his own movie on the world's biggest stage. Titanic won just about every major award that year, except the Oscars. It won Best Motion Picture, a Drama, and Best Director at the Golden Globes. The film was one of the biggest surprises of the British ceremony, unable to turn its 10 nominations, including Best Film and Best Director, at the BAFTAs into wins. In 1997 and 1998, the movie also won scores of other awards for critical recognition from organizations around the world, but awards are only the most obvious layer of Titanic's legacy. The film gave culture and cinema much more than statuettes and trophies. The first clear, quantifiable effect was on the careers of the two leads. Before Titanic, Leonardo DiCaprio was a respected actor, known for What's Eating Gilbert Grape and Romeo plus Juliet, but a far cry from international superstardom. After Titanic, he was immediately one of the most famous actors in the world, but he had to face a challenge few actors can meet. How do you escape the shadow of a character the whole world associates with your face and your name? In the decades that followed, DiCaprio spent his time building a resolutely different career. Martin Scorsese's films, complex and morally ambiguous roles, projects polar opposite to the Jack Dawson character in terms of style. That's precisely why he's one of the best actors of his generation. Kate Winslet had a similar route to stardom, but in a different way. Over the years, she became one of Hollywood's most serious and respected actresses, with regular Oscar nominations, until she won the award for The Reader in 2009, with 6 nominations. She today joins the most nominated actresses in Academy history. This career was launched on the international stage by Titanic. For Cameron, Titanic was both a culmination and a departure. Avatar was released in 2009, and Cameron didn't direct another feature film until 2021. A deliberate hiatus in which he developed the 3D camera technology that would be at the heart of Avatar. So with Avatar in 2009, Cameron took everything he had learned on Titanic about massive scale production and took it to the next level, and the result was a new global box office record. Titanic has left a profound and permanent imprint in the field of cinematic technology. Today, Digital Domain is one of the world's leading visual effects companies. The techniques developed for the film, like water simulation and digital extras, were refined to become benchmark tools in the industry. Cameron has always considered digital effects a complement, not a replacement, for practical effects. That is what generations of directors saw in Titanic, that digital technology is much more believable when it's rooted in physical reality. Cameron was the one who first brought 3D directly to narrative formats with the 3D re-release of Titanic in 2012, and later with Avatar, which proved 3D to be a commercially viable option for massive productions. Titanic was re-released in 3D in April 2012 to mark the centenary of the sinking, bringing in $343 million in global grosses during that run, a remarkable figure for a 15-year-old film, proving that the audience's emotional connection to the movie was still there. The Titanic left a footprint in popular culture that's still visible decades later. The ship's bow scene, "I'm flying, Jack," is one of the most parodied, quoted and referenced images in film history. It's been on TV, in movies, in commercials and in memes a million times. "You jump, I jump" is a phrase often used in many languages to mean absolute loyalty, and the debate over whether there was room on the wooden door continues to leak ink on the internet. Discussions, videos, scientific analysis, almost 30 years after the movie's release. For an entire generation, the song "My Heart Will Go On" became the definition of cinematic romance itself. The most played single globally on radio in 1998. It still rings out on TV shows, movies, parties, or any moment trying to conjure romance or nostalgia. For millions of us born in the 90s, this music is a time machine. A few notes are enough to conjure the visceral memory of sitting in a theater, heart-aching, watching Jack and Rose. In 2017, the Library of Congress chose Titanic for preservation in the United States National Film Registry for being culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant. This recognition is about more than entertainment value. The film now stands alongside other works that helped shape American cultural identity and deserve to be preserved for future generations. It has only aroused academic interest over the years. The case of Titanic is studied in universities in film studies, history, cultural studies, marketing and executive production courses. It is a textbook case, studied from multiple disciplines at once: epic production, marketing phenomenon, class narrative, model of effective emotional storytelling, and a major technological breakthrough. But maybe the most amazing part of Titanic's legacy is the one no number can truly quantify. The film continues to be discovered by new generations who weren't even born when it came out. Today, -1 or 16-year-old teenagers watch Titanic streamed, and it has the same effect on them as it did on their parents in dark theaters in 1998. The same heartache, the same tears at the end, the same irresistible urge to listen to the music one more time during the credits. Now that's a legacy. It's not a box office figure. It's not a shelf trophy. It is a story that does not die, that is handed on from generation to generation, and that moves people in the same way, because it touches something that time cannot change.